We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes.
Cathy J. Cohen is Professor of Political Science and Director of the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture at the University of Chicago. Before going to the University of Chicago, Cohen taught for 9 years at Yale University. Cohen is the third African-American woman in Yale's 300-year history to receive tenure, and the first in the social sciences to ever receive tenure at Yale. In all of her work, Professor Cohen attempts to speak to and bridge her many identities and communities, exploring the possibility and difficulties of joint political struggles. Her field of academic specialization is American politics, and her interests include African American politics, women in politics, lesbian and gay politics, social movements, and Black feminist theory. She's the author of the book, The Boundaries of Blackness, AIDS and the Breakdown of Black Politics, which was named one of the top 100 books on African Americans of the 20th century. Professor Cohen is also co-editor of Women Transforming Politics, an alternative reader. Professor Cohen's political involvements similarly challenge identity-based movements to recognize and act on the diversity within their membership. She is the former co-chair and a founding board member of the Audrey Lorde Project in New York, an organization committed to progressive organizing around queer issues across communities of color. She served on the board of Kitchen Table, Women of Color Press, and the Center for Lesbian and Gay Studies at CUNY. Cohen was a founding member of Black AIDS Mobilization, also known as BAM, and a core organizer of the international conference Black Nations, Queer Nations. Cohen has also served as an active member in many organizations, such as the Black Radical Congress, African American Women in Defense of Ourselves, and the United Coalition Against Racism. Hi, I'm Liz Cole, and welcome to another in our series of interviews for the Global Feminisms Project. And today, I'm delighted that we're interviewing Cathy Cohen.
Thank you.
Welcome, Cathy.
Thank you.
We're going to talk for about an hour, and then at that point, we will open it up to questions from our audience. So I thought we could start by talking a little bit about what your life path has been like to lead you to the place where you are today. And I know that's a really broad question, but maybe you could talk a little bit about where you grew up, if there were formative experiences or role models that shaped your life.
Sure. Well, I want to start by thanking you again for the invitation to participate in this really important project and recognizing all the kind of incredible women of color and feminists of color who are doing just exceptional work to change the world, and so I just feel honored to be a part of this project. But if I kind of think back to where this, I guess, maybe all began at some level, my politics, I would undoubtedly kind of locate my early political learning in my family. And not necessarily because there were kind of explicit political lessons taught, you will do this, your politics will be this, but it really was about kind of who my parents were and what they personified in terms of their political commitments. My father was a letter carrier and was deeply committed to labor politics. I always actually tell this story that I remember him coming home one day, and my sister and brother, we were upstairs but listening like we often did, and he was talking to my mom, and he said, "Oh, they've asked me to become management." And everybody, we had enough labor talk in our house, we knew what management meant. It meant more money, and we were like, "Oh, we're gonna get new tennis shoes, it's gonna be really great." And then I heard him say, I can't do that, right? I mean, that his commitment to kind of the labor union, his commitment to working class struggle was much more important than kind of the advancement that would happen by becoming management in the Postal Service. And it was those types of lessons that we were kind of taught over and over and over again. The same with my mom, who was totally committed to her community, doing work both in the church and the schools, always kind of providing a listening ear in the community that kind of taught a lesson that you always have a commitment to folks, you know, not only your family, but the folks in your neighborhood, the folks that you identify with racially. And so I think long before I ever knew what a feminist was, heard the word feminist, I think I kind of started to develop feminist politics from my mother and my father and my sister and my brother. It's not surprising to me now that my brother's a second grade teacher and actively involved in the union in the Toledo public schools. My sister works in a factory and has really struggled with folks in the factory to establish a union there that unfortunately is now kind of taken over by white leadership that's very hostile to workers of color. But I think we all were taught repeatedly, you must have a commitment to community and you must kind of work to kind of transform people's lives, including your own life. And so for me, I kind of start that political learning back in Toledo. I can go further. You know, and I think through the years, you are very kind of blessed and fortunate to be in places where there are people who can teach you other lessons or teach you more lessons. One of those wonderful experiences actually came here at the University of Michigan when I was a graduate student, and my involvement in an organization called the United Coalition Against Racism. It was my first year of graduate school, I think in 1986, and there was this incredible group of largely black women and some black men and some other folks of color and some white comrades who mobilized around kind of explicitly racist expressions on campus, but also the fact that there weren't enough folks of color, students of color, there weren't enough faculty of color, and the university didn't talk explicitly about how they were going to address those issues. And you know, we did things like take over buildings and sit on committees and negotiate. And I learned so many lessons about, again, commitment to community. I also learned lessons about divisions in community, because there were times when, in fact, other black students kind of attacked us for, in fact, working in collaboration with whites. There were certain students on campus that attacked us for having women leadership, for addressing issues of lesbian, gay, and bisexual and transgendered concerns in terms of student body. So, you know, you learn from both kind of the victories that you have and the battles that you engage in. And it's, for me, kind of a continuous process of kind of adding to my politics. So maybe I start with racial and labor or class politics, and it was really in undergrad and then in graduate school that I started to have what I think is a feminist analysis that talks about power and oppression in kind of multiple sites. But it's been those types of experiences, those types of interactions that I think has kind of really complicated my thinking and hopefully my work.
Well, I would like to talk a little bit more about UCAR, because I was here at that time, as you know, also. Yes. And one of the things I remember is that UCAR was really a departure from other kinds of student groups that had worked on issues of race on campus at that time in terms of its inclusivity. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how UCAR came to have that more inclusive focus and also what the outcome of that was.
Well, in many ways, you know, I could name individuals. There were people like Barbara Ransby and Tracy Matthews and Kim Smith or David Morass, who had, I think, broad political commitments. Hopefully we all had broad political commitments. But I think it's also really an example of what black feminist scholars talk about when they talk about intersectionality, that it's hard to be a black woman and not understand both gender dynamics and gender oppression, and also racial oppression, and also if you come from a working class family, class politics and class oppression. And I think it was significant that within UCAR, there were kind of a group of black women who embodied kind of the intersection of all those struggles, myself included. Meant also that we began to really struggle with and think through how do we begin to talk about sexual orientation and sexuality as also a system of oppression that we have to pay attention to. So I think, you know, it stems from who's in leadership, who can construct an agenda, how do people kind of understand their position and their status in the world, that allowed or kind of dictated a more inclusive framework for UCAR. And I think also, as I just said a moment ago, kind of bearing the brunt of attacks, you really have to kind of sharpen your analysis to defend why you're committed to making sure that there are white comrades involved in this struggle, that we have to understand kind of the manifestations of white supremacy, even on institutions, educational institutions, and the responsibility of whites to take control, not to take control, to take responsibility for dealing with systems of oppression and institutions that preference and provide more power for white students and white faculty. So I think it was a moment of the leadership, it was a moment of the kind of positioning of working class black women, black lesbians, black feminists, that really kind of dictated the inclusive nature of UCAR.
And how did UCAR respond to those attacks when they came?
Well, there's a wide range of responses. Some of them I'll talk about here, some of them I won't. I think one of the things I just said is I think it meant that we really had to kind of debate and talk about what was the importance of having a broad and inclusive agenda. It meant going back and reading things that we hadn't read. It meant inviting black feminists to campus to help us think. I remember when we invited Angela Davis to campus, and she actually sat for a couple of hours with us to help us think through kind of the strategies and the analysis that supported the kind of framework and the institution that we had developed. It meant also, I think, being mad and angry and confronting people. It meant deciding where your political loyalties were, not just your racial loyalties. And so I think it was also kind of a moment of development for many of us about kind of how we would structure our politics. It wasn't about kind of running away in any way from race, because we are all kind of strong, proud black women. But it also meant understanding that just because someone shared a racial identity with us didn't mean that they also shared a political identity with us. And it was kind of an important and growing moment in understanding the distinction between the two. I'm sure young people today can hopefully understand the distinction between me and Condoleezza Rice, let's say. We might share gender and race, but I don't think, God help me, that we share a similar politics. So, yeah.
That's great. Well, one of the things that this project is really interested in is the relationship between scholarship and activism. And that's one reason that the answer you just gave was so fascinating to me, because it seems like your response to this practical mobilization problem was to respond by studying or bringing other scholars here to talk with you.
I don't think it was just studying, so I don't want to represent it in that sense. I mean, part of it was the kind of day-to-day work of being an activist and being hopefully an organizer. So it meant not only did you kind of fine-tune your analysis, but it meant you kind of sharpen your analysis not only through books but through conversation, through the process of organizing people. So if you're trying to bring someone into your organization and they ask that question, you better be able to kind of respond to them in an accurate and, I think, effective way that explains to people why it's important in certain cases to work with white comrades, why it's important for an organization entitled United Coalition Against Racism to think about questions of sexuality, right? And who's included, to have that debate about who's included even within black communities, who as students or who as a organization are we representing? So it wasn't just about kind of book learning, and I want to kind of reject that dichotomy anyway between there's scholarship and then there's activism. And sometimes there's a clear distinction, but sometimes, in fact, we would hope that scholarship informs the work that we do as activists and organizers, and vice versa, that the work that we do as organizers and activists hopefully has to inform the scholarship that we pursue.
Very well put. Well, that's a great segue into what I'd like to ask you about next, which is I'd like to talk a little bit about your book, The Boundaries of Blackness, both to understand this dynamic of the relationship between scholarship and activism, because it's a book that's won scholarly honors, but at the same time it appears to have grown out of your political involvements. And I also understand that you've received criticism about the effect that the book could have on black communities. So I thought maybe to start, for those who aren't familiar with the book, could you summarize it a little bit and tell us about how you came to write it?
Definitely. I laugh when you say summarize it. I remember it started as a dissertation that was like 600 pages long, and so the idea of summarizing it could be difficult, but I'll try to do it. the work is really focused on understanding the political response to HIV and AIDS by primarily traditional Black leaders and organizations, newspapers, magazines, and Black elected officials. You know, there was a puzzle for me when I started this work, which was in late 1980s. It was really kind of the emergence of AIDS on a national scale, where we had already experienced Rock Hudson. People were talking about HIV and AIDS. And I knew on a personal level that it was impacting Black communities, because I was integrated and rooted in Black, lesbian, gay communities. So I had friends who were HIV positive. I had, you know, groups of friends and networks that were talking about these issues. And when I looked to kind of AIDS coverage on television and magazines, what I primarily saw was white, gay, and lesbian folks demanding that, in fact, the country, the government, public officials pay attention to this. And so it was a puzzle for me of understanding that this was a disease impacting Black communities. And I probably, even at that moment, didn't know how much it was impacting Black communities. And the lack of mobilization I saw around this issue, especially from a community that had a history of mobilizing around racism, injustice, and white supremacy. So the book was really kind of an attempt to really understand why the lack of mobilization. And as I often say, I think there was probably more mobilization than I knew. So once I started researching, I found in particular that Black gay men were doing a lot of work in certain Black communities, in urban Black communities like in New York and in Los Angeles. But that traditional leadership, whether it be in the Black church, be Black elected officials, be the editors of the Amsterdam News or Essence magazine, really kind of wanted to shy away and deny that this was a significant issue for Black communities. And so part of what the book tries to do is to put that in a historical context, to understand that it's, while clearly a lot of that is driven by homophobia, that it's not just homophobia, that there's a history of marginalization that the Black community has experienced, where they've been defined as outsiders or secondary, and that through that process there's a real reluctance to kind of engage or own stigmatized issues. And that for many Black traditional organizations, they've chosen what many people have called a kind of politics of respectability, where we attempt to kind of prove ourselves to be good enough, to be normal, to be upstanding, with the hope that maybe if we're good enough, you'll include us in the American dream, the American fabric. The problem is that if in fact we're going to articulate this idea of community, then it means we take all of the diversity of that community, and that we also have to kind of really explore to what degree we're willing to join a kind of normative structure, a society that says you have to behave in certain ways, you have to be normalized in certain ways, and you have to have certain types of identities, whether they be heterosexual or proper Black women. And so the book really tries to kind of struggle with the question of respectability and crisis and difference in Black communities.
And so what kind of responses have you gotten both from inside and outside the academy?
Well, you know, I've learned a lesson that books take a while, as we say, to trickle down. So the first couple years, the book was really kind of read by other academics. And I think I was very pleased and overwhelmed that most people, I think, thought the book contributed to our understanding and thinking around Black politics, that it tried to give voice in particular to the diversity and the contestation around politics and identity that we find in Black communities, that it didn't present a homogenous Black community where we all share the same politics and all have the same kind of racial agenda. And in particular for feminist scholars, for folks interested in lesbian and gay politics, for individuals interested in social movements, who are always kind of interested in non-traditional, extra-systemic ways in which people engage politically, I think the book was very well received. There are always, and I would hope that in fact there'd be at times negative response, because if you don't get some response, negative response, it means that you probably haven't said enough, or you haven't said anything maybe important. And I think there have been others that would suggest that there's the old argument, you shouldn't air dirty laundry. So, you shouldn't necessarily talk about different parts and the struggles that happen within Black communities. I think other individuals would say that while studying HIV and AIDS is an important issue, it may not be the most important issue when thinking about, for example, the political agenda of Black communities. But overall, most people have been, or most academics have been very receptive. What I think I find more rewarding even, not that I don't appreciate the response in the academic community, what I've found more rewarding is that in after a couple of years of the book being in the academic community, it started to, in fact, find its way to activists who were often, say, on the front line of providing services, struggling around funding for HIV and AIDS in communities of color. And so over the last 2 or 3 years, I've been asked to come and present the book, the ideas in the book, to national AIDS organizations or state-based AIDS organizations, individuals who don't in any way have a relationship to the academy, but who think that there were things in the book that would be important to informing the work that they do on a daily basis. And that really has been very rewarding. I feel good about that work. And I have learned a tremendous amount from kind of talking to people about the practicality of thinking through these kind of divisions, and the practicality and the dynamics of kind of people's struggle around identity within their communities and within their neighborhoods and within their schools. So it's been good.
Well, it's clear that this book is probably your largest academic endeavor to date. Although it's also clear that the themes in the book are something that resonate throughout the other work, scholarly work that you've done.
Sure.
But I'm wondering if there is an organizational experience that you've had that you think of as sort of defining of your work in a similar way.
That's a great question. It might be the work that I've done with the Audrey Lorde Project in New York. I think of the Audrey Lorde Project as just an outstanding organization. It was started as a lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered organization servicing and advocating, struggling for people of color, queer people of color. Queer meaning, in this case, kind of those engaged in what are traditionally understood to be kind of non-normative sexual behaviors. But again, because of who we all were in terms of folks around the table, we understood that our lives weren't just defined by kind of sexual oppression. And that for many people, they would say that the primary basis of the discrimination, inequality, oppression that they experienced came from race or came from the interaction of race and gender or class. And so the Audrey Lorde Project, I think, exemplifies both the politics and the writings of Audrey Lorde, but also kind of the more complicated understanding of struggle and community that the folks around those initial tables that were planning this organization also understood from their lived experience. So the Audrey Lorde Project is an organization that's based in a Black community in Brooklyn, New York, in Fort Greene, with the mission of advocating and struggling for queer folks of color as well as communities of color. So the Audrey Lorde Project has been, for example, very active around some of the police brutality cases in New York, even though those cases wouldn't traditionally be defined as kind of, issues around sexuality. The idea behind the Audrey Lorde Project is to kind of begin to make those links, to understand kind of the ways in which the state regulates all sorts of behaviors and all sorts of identities. And if you don't begin to kind of connect those dots, let's say, then you can kind of fight on one realm or one dimension and miss, in fact, the ways in which the state regulates those you care about in all sorts of other dimensions. So, for example, if we talked about gay marriage, there's a movement afoot, I guess, for some to want access to the institution of marriage. I think there are some progressive lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender folks, I put myself in that category, who understand the history of marriage, the way in which the institution was used to kind of signify who was a citizen and who wasn't, who was proper and who wasn't, who worry about kind of what happens when we begin to again solidify those good lesbian and gay people who marry and those who don't, who understand and worry about what happens to heterosexual people who don't marry or who don't marry and have children, quote unquote, out of wedlock. And so understand kind of marriage as an institution of regulation. So if we understand the impact of marriage in all those different realms, maybe not directly on me, but the people that I love and the people who I live with, then I have a responsibility, because, you know, that's my interest also, to protect them and to fight for them, as well as to fight for myself, to oppose marriage even though it might seem like it's just a basic equality issue. To me, it just, you can't think of marriage and you can't think of politics along that dimension.
So that's something else that the Audrey Lorde Project has been working on?
The Audrey Lorde Project works on, issues like marriage. It works on issues around police brutality. It works on issues around welfare reform, when in fact very few organizations wanted to talk about welfare reform as a devastating issue on Black communities, as an attack on Black women and women of color and their children. So the kind of significance of the Audrey Lorde Project is it really is an organization, I think, that provided me with an outlet for kind of thinking broadly about politics and kind of the multiple realms and multiple dimensions where we have to fight. Yeah.
Great. With that, I anticipated my next question. So let me ask you, you've done a great job of summarizing some of the key ideas of your book in a very short time, but that sort of brings me to want to know, so what are the kind of questions that are animating your work now?
Right. You know, I'm always concerned with the question of identity and who belongs and who doesn't belong. I mean, in the book, one of the major themes, I probably didn't talk about it, is this question of how do we understand membership, and who is a member and who isn't a member, and what is that membership based on. One of my concerns in the book was when we talked about Black communities and being committed to a Black political agenda, that there were all sorts of ways in which Blackness was contested. And so it wasn't just kind of phenotypic, you know, if you looked like you were Black, but that there were also normative standards for what Blackness was. The example I often give is I was teaching a course, I think at Yale, on Black politics, and we were talking about the Supreme Court or something, and talking about Clarence Thomas. And, you know, the room had, I think half the students were African American, and maybe 5 were, so 10 were African American, 5 were white, and 5 were Latino. And there was a kind of heated argument between one young African American man and one young African American woman about Clarence Thomas. And at one point she said, well, he's not Black anyway, right? And I noticed that the white students were like, wait a minute, you know, like, I saw him on TV, he looked Black to me. And at that moment, you know, what was happening was she wasn't talking about phenotypic description, but she was talking about kind of a normative understanding of what Black people do in certain situations to advance other Black people, or to advance kind of progressive agenda. And so what the book tries to do is to kind of really question not only kind of phenotypic Blackness, but how do we decide who's Black enough for the community to mobilize around. And oftentimes when thinking about HIV and AIDS, those who are most at risk, Black gay men, Black men who sleep with men, Black injection drug users, Black women engaged in kind of sexual exchange for money, are not always considered Black enough, right? That somehow their behavior questions their authenticity. And so I was hoping in the book to kind of really push through what categories mean, like membership and identity. And I'm hoping that the new work that I'm doing now also tries to push through kind of questions of or concepts like, in this case, deviance and agency and resistance. I have a new piece out in the Du Bois Review where I'm trying to figure out how do we begin to take a different approach to behaviors that traditionally have been pathologized within Black communities. And when I say within Black communities, meaning behaviors that have been pathologized not only by whites towards Black communities, but that often have been pathologized by white scholars. So if you go back to Du Bois, or if you read William Julius Wilson, or any number of other books, you will find things like unwed mothers being pathologized as having kind of a different set of norms or values, a whole discussion of the underclass. And I'm asking scholars who are committed to those communities to maybe step back. And it's very hard because people get very upset with me about this, to step back and figure out if there's something of really significance and value in people making non-normative choices. And what I mean is, the easy case, for example, is what should we learn when people who have very few resources, young, Black, lesbians, right, who have very few resources, who don't have the protection of being middle class and a professor, so I can talk about being out and things of that sort, when they come out, right, what is, is that an act of deviance or an act of defiance? And if it's an act of defiance, how do we begin to link that ability and that agency, as limited as it is, to like larger resistance struggles? How do we begin to reconceptualize resistance? So that, I think, for some people is the easy case. The harder case where people take issue is, how do we understand, or should we understand, for example, young people who engage in sexual relationships that don't, or intimate relationships that don't fit some norm, that in the past researcher after researcher has demonized as these kind of bad things. And in certain ways there are detrimental consequences. There are detrimental consequences from pregnancy if you don't have enough resources. But is there something that we need to try to figure out or try to learn from when people make choices in pursuit of desire, in pursuit of happiness, that contradict messages that are strongly enforced, for example, by the state, by their communities? I mean, there's a level of defiance there that I think you can write off very easily as pathological, or we can try to understand it possibly as having, at least exerting some level of agency, if we don't call it resistance. And if we begin to understand the exertion of kind of limited agency, constrained agency, is there a way to kind of learn from that as we build political movements and social movements? My concern is that quite often when we look for politics in very traditional places, right? So if you go to a union hall and join the union, then you're political. If you protest the war and go into the street, then you're political. Even if you vote, some people would say you're political, at least exerting some type of politics. And I'm not suggesting that engaging in quote-unquote non-normative behavior is politics. I, in fact, don't want to do that. But I do want to suggest it is about some level of agency that I think we can use and we can think about that might help us understand how to get young people, for example, into politics, into a place where they can work to transform their neighborhoods and their states and their country.
What do you think it would take to help them convert that kind of agency into a political agency?
Well, I think first and foremost, one of the things we'd have to do is actually have a political agenda that spoke to where they were and what they were interested in. I worry that we have kind of a politics that's defined around as nothing against the middle class. I've experienced social mobility from the working class and now middle class, but I think we have a political agenda quite often in Black communities and communities of color, and even in feminist politics, that's usually defined by the experiences of those with greater resources. And so it can often be about kind of middle class issues, about a certain type of access that other people will never experience. And so if we could figure out, and I say this in the paper, and I think other organizers will tell you, it seems to me the first thing we have to do is listen to folks. Like, what are they concerned with? What drives their desires and their hopes and their dreams? And also their fears and their hatred at times and alienation for, whether it be traditional institutions, the state, or the academy. So I think that seems to me the first thing is to kind of actually listen. And the second thing I think is to get into a position where we can help kind of organize, and I don't mean impose, but I mean provide resources to organize folks in communities of color and in resource-poor communities so that they can then take their articulation of the political agenda and push it forward. And that's a different way of thinking about investing in poor communities. I mean, one model is also is a social service provision, and we always want to kind of deal with and respect people's basic needs. But I think another basic needs is kind of political efficacy and political power. And so, in addition to social services, what else can we provide to communities of color and to poor communities to help with the kind of process of political empowerment? And I think hopefully that's another direction that we can really begin to kind of pay attention to.
Well, I feel like the whole conversation we've been having is sort of skating around this next question that I would like to ask you, but when I first contacted you about doing the interview, you expressed some reservations about whether you were an appropriate person and that maybe you were more of a scholar than an activist, and did you belong in this group? And I feel like you've been making these connections between political work and academic work, but I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit more directly. How do you see those interacting either in your own career or more generally? Because a lot of students we work with often sort of talk about it in terms of a dichotomy. I don't want to be an academic, I want to be an activist, or I don't want to be in that ivory tower. So,
me either. That's right. It's a hard thing to try to bridge, and I'm not sure I would. This was what we were talking about when you called. I'm not sure I figured out how to be both an activist and a scholar at the same time. I have a real skepticism for academics who say, oh, I do my political work in the classroom, which we undoubtedly do political work in the classroom, but to me that can't be the extent of your political work. And that's not to deny kind of the importance of ideas to kind of animating all of the work that we do in terms of politics. But it seems to me that part of what it means to be a scholar activist is not only to kind of engage political questions in your work, but to place yourself in institutions and organizations where you can be held accountable for the work that you do. Part of a big kind of connecting point for me is this question of accountability. Like, who do you answer to? And, there's a clear power dynamic in classrooms between the professor and the student, so you don't really answer to students. So the question for me becomes really, how do I construct a kind of life, not just scholarship or activism, that's about kind of political activism and social transformation? And I don't think I always get it right. My guess is I don't get it right a lot of the time. But I do think that, and we were talking about this earlier, that part of my motivation for the work that I do is about kind of practical concerns. So I'm starting a new project on African American youth and their politics and their sexuality. Now, a lot of the reason I'm doing this work is because I love my nephew and niece, and I worry that black people were losing a generation of young black people. And I wish I could say, oh, there's a bigger motivation, and it is. The commitment to black communities, but that's in the abstract. It's because I see, for example, if I watch BET and I see the images of young black women, I don't want my niece to understand that that's what's portrayed to her through popular culture in terms of who she is. And when I kind of look at my nephew, who I love, I love them both. I spoil them both. But who's older now. I remember when Terry was born. He's now 28 and has, you know, he and I have talked about this publicly, so I'm not revealing anything, has had encounters with the criminal justice system. I feel like I need to do something both in terms of my scholarship and in terms of my activism, and it's, of course, on a personal level, to kind of not only provide him with resources so he can navigate that, but to really kind of change those institutions. Because if I help him navigate it, there's some other kid that may not have someone with those types of resources that can help them navigate it. And so to me, it's about kind of what are the tools that I have at hand to do that type of work. And one of the major tools that I have is the ability to kind of write and have the time to think and to talk to people and to gather data that might help in a process of changing those institutions. Now, you know, my worry is that places where we would expect to find scholar activists or more scholar activism, places like women's studies programs, gay and lesbian studies projects, African American studies, Latino studies, Asian American studies programs and departments have become more and more detached from actually the everyday lives of the people that we supposedly represent in those institutions. And I'm not, and so this goes back to my skepticism about kind of scholar activism, because I think quite often people assume that because they're in those more marginalized spaces on academic campuses, that being there is just is their politics. And I want to suggest that those institutions in those spots, while marginalized clearly, are still professionalized. They're still part of academic institutions, and that there's still an absence of accountability to the folks kind of, as I often talk about, just outside those gated communities we call universities, right? To hold us accountable for the things that we write and the things that we say. So when you called and said, we're doing this great project on global feminism, and you started telling me the names of people who were going to be interviewed, I thought, well, those are exceptional people who spend kind of their daily lives, day in and day out. You know, I keep talking about on the kind of front line of engagement in neighborhoods and communities where they are held accountable and they're in organizations where the democratic process, and that's different, I think, than the work of my work. Even though I try as much as I can on a daily basis to make sure that I'm located in institutions where I can be held accountable.
But you were telling me at lunch that one of the missions of the institute that you're directing now is to make those kind of connections outside of the university. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Sure. I have the privilege of directing the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture at the University of Chicago. And there are kind of many goals of the center. One is about kind of producing, you know, important intellectual work from largely a comparative race framework that understands the intersection of race with other identities and ideologies around gender and sexuality and class. We're also quite interested at the center in supporting the work of both undergraduates and graduate students by engaging in the curriculum and helping to redefine the curriculum. But the thing I think that the center is most engaged, most committed to, that I'm proud of, is this idea of producing engaged scholarship. And the idea is that we want to produce scholarship that holds to the rigor of the academy, of course, but that we also want to produce scholarship that is relevant and applicable and accessible to folks who may not be located in the academy. We want to produce scholarship that will help people transform their own lives, with the recognition that people are already doing, you know, really important work outside the academy. So it's not like they're waiting on us to tell them the truth. It's really kind of how do you work in a principled way in partnership with institutions, with neighborhoods, with communities that aren't a part of the university. And how do you do that when oftentimes those neighborhoods and communities are very suspicious, to say the least, of what happens within the university. Universities where they generally don't feel like they can, they want to send their kids. Universities where they don't feel they can walk on campus without the police harassing them. Universities that have engaged in urban development and kind of wiped out neighborhoods. And so it's, the challenge I think for us is to kind of think of this as a long-term project. And the idea isn't, when we talk about engaged scholarship, to go out and study a community and write a book and then maybe come back and present the book at the library one Saturday. But how do you really build principle relationships and partnerships where there's going to be some negotiation, where you have to figure out ways to share power, where there has to be the acknowledgement that we come with more resources, but they may come with more knowledge about neighborhoods and communities. And it really is not easy work. I think it's one thing to say that's what you want to do. And I think, unfortunately, far too many research institutes don't even say that. Or if they say that, what they mean is we'll open up our seminar room if some community group wants to come to campus and have a meeting. But we're really trying to figure out, how do you promote this type of scholarship? How do you promote that type of scholarship also in institutions where the incentive structure is not to go outside the university, right? So if you're a junior faculty member trying to get tenure, and we're suggesting you go outside and build long-term relationships, and your tenure clock is running, what are the choices that you're going to make? And by the time that you get tenure, you usually already have a research agenda. So now we're suggesting that you change your research agenda or you open it up a bit. It becomes very difficult. So even to do something like engage scholarship through the center, it means that the center has to be engaged in a political process within the university to try to change some of the incentive structures there. Yeah.
Well, as we're getting towards the end, I would like to ask you some more general questions. And one question that we try to ask everyone is, would you use the term feminist to describe yourself or your work?
Oh, definitely, yes. And I know there's a controversy, well, not a controversy. I know that there are a number of black women who, where we would probably describe politics in the same way, and an analysis of power and understanding patriarchy and patriarchy's intersection with race, and concerns about misogyny. We might all kind of start down that road and go down that road, and then if you ask what would be the label, I would say feminist, and a number of black women in particular would say womanist. A number of black women think of feminism as a primarily white identified and controlled and occupied term. And I understand, and I would even say respect that position. But for me, it's about reclaiming. It's about kind of the numerous black women that engage in what I would argue are feminist politics, and claiming their histories and who they are, whether it be Ida B. Wells or Anna Julia, I mean, you can go down that list. And so that's important for me. It's important for me also to not kind of give over the term feminist to white women only. And I'm not, not saying white women are saying this is our term. It's also important for me to kind of use that term in the same way I use progressive or radical, in the same way I talk about white supremacy, to me a kind of political and historical accuracy so that people understand the politics and the analysis that I'm engaged in. And it's, it's also important to use the word feminism for me to just begin a dialogue. Mm-hmm. I know when I use the word feminist in my classes, there are a lot of young women who are just like, God, not you too, right? So, and they're thinking second wave feminists, don't like sex, don't laugh. I hope that's not me. So, and so to even struggle around and to kind of educate ourselves around the ways in which ideas and terms and labels change over time, from first wave to second wave and now third wave feminists. So for me, it's important to kind of take on that title, take on that label, to combine it with black, so that I'm a black feminist, to combine it with progressive or radical, to make sure that it's embedded in a whole, whole kind of configuration of labels and politics that I think changes what feminism means for me from what maybe others might use, how they might use it.
Well, while we're talking about terms, I wonder if you could also talk about what you mean when you say progressive, because this tape will be viewed by people from all over the world,
Right.
and that might not mean the same thing to them.
I'm sure it doesn't mean the same thing. I'm a big believer in kind of historical specificity. When I'm talking about progressive, I'm talking about a political analysis that understands the intersection of, let's say it gets too academic, but multiple systems of oppression, and that the commitment isn't just to gain some level of equality within the status quo. So to be able to marry because I'm a lesbian, or be able to marry even though I'm a lesbian, but to really kind of think about progressively transforming the institutions, the state regulation that defines our politics today. I think, you know, we have to think about new ways and new structures in terms of the distribution of resources in this society. I mean, we didn't really have a chance to talk about class politics, but, you know, there's an increasingly smaller and smaller group, even within the United States, not to mention the United States, that controls most of the resources of the world. And so how do you not begin to talk about and have an analysis about changing that? It's not that, and I'm lucky to have lots of resources now, but you know, I was talking to my partner, Beth Ritchie, last night, and I said, we were saying, we almost feel guilty. You notice almost. But we do feel guilty. It's like, why do we get more resources than other people? And so I think there has to be discussions about kind of not how do we get a few more people into those categories, but how do we really redistribute resources? And then that takes us to kind of other terms that people don't want to discuss anymore, like socialism. So for me, in terms of progressive, it just means not only kind of recognizing the inequality, but also recognizing kind of the status quo and making a commitment to changing both the inequality by changing the status quo. Yeah.
So it sounds like you see your work as being an extension of, or even continuous with certain traditions within mainstream feminism, or how would you characterize that relationship?
Well, I think it would depend, right, on first how we're defining mainstream feminism. Like, there are probably many mainstream feminisms. There's a mainstream feminism within Black feminism that might look different than mainstream feminism in other places. You know, I think that, in fact, there's an analysis that comes with the feminist label, let's say. A concern around gender inequality, a concern around the dominance of patriarchy, not even the existence and the dominance of patriarchy, misogyny and hatred of women, and the ways in which those assumptions get structured in to the kind of production of a society, as well as kind of the closeness to how we understand normal sexuality, heteronormativity, to function in the world and in the society. So in that sense, sure, if those are kind of the basics and the assumptions of feminism, that's definitely a part of what I would say my politics are committed to and my analysis is a part of. But I think hopefully feminism is also in transformation. Maybe not, but I hope it is. And it means that if you take into account other factors or the intersection of race, then you have to kind of really think through a position on, not a position on patriarchy, but the ways and the contours, the nuances of patriarchy. How do we understand, for example, Black men's male privilege within a white supremacist or racist society? So can they be allies with Black women on certain fronts, and when in fact do they participate possibly more effectively than white men in the destruction and demonization of Black women? One of the things we were talking about is, you know, I'm obsessed these days with this Nelly video. Y'all know, tip drill, because to me, I can't, I mean, if, for the audience who hasn't seen the video, it really is just the most degrading representation of black women that I've seen in a very, very, very long time, and the commercialization of black women's bodies. And it's done by a black rapper, Nelly. And so, you know, to understand Nelly's position within a corporate structure, the music structure, where at some level he has very little power to make quote unquote final decisions, but to also understand his power to make a video like that, and the kind of concerns and the representation that he puts forth about how he thinks about, and I think communicates how other black men should think about black women's bodies, black women's agency, and their significance in the world. And so you know, feminism informs that. Black feminist analysis, I think, is more instructive for me in thinking through the Nellys of the world. Because, you know, I think we have a clearer sense of kind of the larger macro structures. I think it's kind of time for many of us to really define and pay attention to, not that black feminists haven't done this already, the contours and nuances of power and contestation within our own communities, and to take a political stance against those issues also.
Well, let me ask you sort of the biggest question then, which is, how do you see your work intersecting with work going on in other parts of the world, either through professional relationships that you've had, or?
It's, if there's one major disappointment, I'm sure there are many areas of disappointment, but if there's one major area of disappointment in terms of my political work, it's that it has had very little international connection. I feel like I've learned a great deal from kind of transnational movements, but I haven't really kind of traveled to be engaged either in political struggles in other parts of the world, or to visit activists in other parts of the world and to learn from that. You know, part of that is working class background, even though that's where you just didn't travel out of the country, and so, or you didn't think past, oftentimes, the country, outside of this country. Part of it is just, I think at times it's American exceptionalism, even in progressive movements, where we too often, I think the work that we do here can't be informed by the work that's being done in other parts of the world. And that's when we have a level of consciousness that the work that we're doing here is actually happening in other places, and usually happening in more progressive and sometimes effective ways. And so, for example, the work I've done around HIV and AIDS, I feel, has been incredibly beneficial to my learning process, but hopefully beneficial to the work here in the U.S. But I've had very little contact with folks, for example, in the Caribbean, in South Africa, in Southeast Asia, who are also engaged in many of the same struggles, you know, whether it be around, you know, securing drugs for people, or the demonization of women in the process of thinking about HIV and AIDS. I had the opportunity to meet Zaki Ahmad from South Africa a few years ago when we were doing Black Nations, Queer Nations, and that was really an incredible learning experience to talk about the relationship between the struggle around HIV and AIDS, in particular in black communities here, and the struggle around HIV and AIDS in South Africa. And so one of the things I would hope for, as you know, as you grow and get older, is an opportunity to have more of those transnational, international conversations, to learn more both about the exception and the rule in terms of the ways in which people are structuring their politics and their political struggles, and to think creatively outside of kind of American capitalism about what things we might ask for, ways to mobilize people, even ways to engage in kind of educational campaigns. So it's been missing, and I'm hoping that it will appear in the future.
Well, I would like to thank you because this has been just wonderful.
Well, thank you.
And now I would like to give some other people some chances to ask some questions. So at this point, maybe we could go to our audience and see if there's something they would like to ask you.
Absolutely.
Well, I'll begin. Cathy, it's such a pleasure to see you again.
Hi, Dale.
Whether or not you realize it, I think that your work is having an international effect. And I had the opportunity to meet Nisha Hanif last week, who I think you may or may not recall from your days here at Michigan.
Absolutely.
She and I were on a picket line last week because she's one of many of the lecturers who are without job security and benefits at the university, but that's a further aside that we don't need to explore. Or we should explore, but maybe not in this venue.
Right.
Nisha wanted to know if you could draw some comparisons between student activism on campuses and in communities today and the way that it was done in, she called it the good old days, which I take her to mean her days, the days back when you and Barbara Ransby and other women of color were working with UCAR and at the Ella Baker Center.
Right. Well, of course I remember Nisha's, and please tell her I said hello. Thank you for the question. I have to say I'm a little reluctant to take on the good old days because, they were the good old days because we were young and skipping classes and, and hopefully making a significant change on this campus and also joining with people who are making changes on other campuses. And I think that happens in other places today also. I've seen students mobilize at Columbia and at Brown and, sometimes at the University of Chicago, but not as much as I would like. And you were on a picket line just last week, so I don't want to suggest that students today don't do anything. I do think that the political environment has changed drastically. I think we have to say the least, conservative political environment where patriotism is running very high, where to stand on a picket line is somehow to question your allegiance to the country, to democratic processes, which in fact, standing on a picket line really should exemplify your commitment to democratic processes. So I think that there are kind of higher standards possibly, and I'm not sure of that, but it's hard to mobilize young people in this political environment. There's also the reality that always exists, back then and existed now, about how many folks you could mobilize also, because lots of people feel like, look, this is my chance at mobility. I have to be here because you know what, I need to get a job. I need to kind of figure out a way to help not only myself but my families. And I think sometimes we can see politics as something that's outside of that process. The other thing, I'll say again, it's not just students but also faculty. I keep preaching this line about the kind of professionalization and specialization of the academy, as well as places where, in fact, we need faculty to stand up and provide a different kind of oppositional analysis, but also oppositional practice. And so I'm not sure you have as many faculty members, not lecturers, but faculty members willing to stand on picket lines today, or willing to refuse to cross a picket line, or willing to go with students when they take over a building. In 1986, when we took over a building, there weren't a lot of faculty there, but I remember Ernie Wilson, I remember Alden Morris, who brought donuts and orange juice. Neither one are here today, so maybe that tells us something. But they were very supportive, and so I think that there are a number of factors that have come together. And the other thing that I think, I don't want to go into lots of detail because we don't have enough time, but we really also have to talk about what types of students are on college campuses, especially research, predominantly white institutions. Oftentimes those students are middle class students of color who may either have more resources that allow them to protest, or often have had less experience protesting and understanding alienation and systems of oppression. And so I'm just saying the kind of configuration of the population, also a student population can also have an impact in terms of whether students are willing to protest or not. But I think the good old days were back then, the good old days are now, the good old days will be in the future. Anytime, you know, young people decide that their futures have to be determined through their participation, whether it be voting at the national level or whether it be organizing in the places where we exist, namely college campuses for the moment. Okay.
I guess I have a question. I wanted to ask a question about, you mentioned class politics, and it was very interesting, also coming from a working class family, and I also went to a historically black college for undergrad.
Mm-hmm.
And when I got here, like the kind of division within the African American community itself, and it was almost really bizarre how the most of the marginalization I felt actually came from African American students who had gone to prestigious white universities and who had like all kinds of misconceptions and prejudices about both working class black people and people who attended institutions that were not sort of on par with the University of Michigan. I was wondering if you could talk about, having gone through some very prestigious institutions, how you think class has impacted that process.
Absolutely. I mean, I would, first of all, say that I had the same experience. You know, I think it never occurred to me, growing up working class and in a working class community, now, you know, it was before the Huxtables, I just assumed everybody was, all the black people were working class, because all the black people I knew were working class. And it was really interesting to me, I think it really came home in graduate school more than undergraduate, that most of my colleagues of color were middle class, and that had defined their experience very differently. They had gone to, and I would argue, better schools, were better prepared for the rigors of the University of Michigan graduate program. At times, I think, felt more comfortable and knew how to do things like network and connect better than I did. And while I wouldn't say I felt alienated from them, I think I was often surprised by, at times, the lack of connection other than a racial identity that we share. And that's not to say that many of those folks aren't some of my best friends from graduate school, but it is to say that the assumption somehow that, you know, and this has been kind of the discussion that was in the New York Times recently, that to let in black students is to necessarily let in working class black students, especially at predominantly white Ivy institutions, is not the case. So if there's in fact a commitment to both race and class diversity, we probably need to pay attention to both race and class and thinking those through. And you know, the other thing is, it means that most of the faculty at these types of institutions, in terms of faculty of color, have also come from middle class backgrounds. And I guess we could argue it possibly shapes the way in which they approach their work. I'm not, you know, I'm an empiricist, so I'd have to like do a study to make sure that's true. It may, in many ways, impact their relationships and their social connectedness to some of those working class neighborhoods that usually are right around the university, or here in Ypsilanti, but in, you know, I'm at University of Chicago, so just outside of Hyde Park. They're very different neighborhoods and black folk. So I think we have to pay attention to the ways in which class has an impact. It's, you know, it's interesting, because since I do work on sexuality, there's always a struggle to get people to talk about questions of sexuality. I think it's just as hard to get people to talk in a quote-unquote real way about class, especially within marginal groups, and to talk about the lack of representation of poor and working class black people on campuses. Do I think if you had more faculty from poor and working class backgrounds, that it would change much of the research agenda found in, for example, African American studies programs? I actually do. And again, these are empirical questions, and so I could be wrong. So yeah, I think it's hard to talk about transforming these institutions without talking about questions of class, as well as they're embedded in kind of discussions of race. Excuse me, and I think if we allow ourselves only to kind of talk about race without talking about race in complex ways, whether it be around gender or sexuality or class, and of course the intersection of all those, as well as nationality. You know, we haven't talked about immigrant populations and how they identify racially, that we really miss understanding kind of both different interests, different needs, different ways to mobilize people, different ways to shape effective political agendas. And if we're, you know, if our goal is really to mobilize people to transform things, I think you have to understand where people come from, their social location, and what they think is important in terms of their identities.
Well, I have a question about, well, as you were talking a lot about class, I thought that probably my question would fit here. I come from the former Soviet Union, and when I first started reading, doing feminist work and doing gender and women's, looking into women's issues, and started reading feminist work, I could not find the connection between what those people were writing about, like Betty Friedan, and my experience. Well, I have never seen a non-working mother and all this. And then I began reading radical feminists, but I'm not a lesbian, and there was not much connection. But then when I began reading African-American feminists, that's where I found the connection to my experience, and that's how I began identifying with the feminism, and that's why I call, well, women like me the other whiteness. I mean, women coming from this post-socialist world. And then when I came to this country, I thought, so I very much see this, the oppression of women as the issue of class. Before you have a paid maternity leave, normal paid maternity leave, what is there to discuss? Well, which was the approach in the country I come from. And when I came into this country, I was expecting to see a lot of struggle in this venue, struggle for better social security, redistribution of resources, etc. And I was surprised to see so much struggle around sexuality, gay, lesbian issues, which to me looks like, well, using a Marxist term, diverting people from the class struggle. Because just, you know, saying, okay, we are all accepting bisexual people, we are all for gay marriage, we are all accepting transgender people. It does not demand anything from you. You just say, I'm such a fine person, and that's it, and nothing in the society changes, actually. So what's your, well, I understand, you know, all the repercussions of what I'm saying, but what's your perspective on that?
Right. Thank you for the question. It was beautifully articulated. I'm going to disagree with a lot of points, but my guess is you would disagree with some of the points you made also. So I don't want to agree, for example, that claiming, for example, that the state recognized lesbian and gay marriages has no impact on the distribution of resources or the ways in which the state operates in terms of thinking about who is kind of questions of normalization, let's say. So if I somehow kind of suggested that, I want to take that back and try to clarify. And in fact, those progressive people who are supporting, for example, the movement, and we can call it a movement, I guess, around gay marriage, one of the arguments is if you look at all the benefits that people receive from the kind of certification of marriage through the state, that it is about kind of the redistribution of resources. It's about allowing someone who has an immigrant status to marry someone so that they can stay in this country. It's about being able to make health decisions for my partner. It's about kind of who's going to get tax breaks and who's, you know. So I in fact think it is a big issue around resources. But I also think we have to think more broadly about questions of sexuality. So questions of sexuality have to also include, first of all, I've made an argument before that I think when we're talking about queer sexuality for me is not lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender sexuality. queer sexuality for me is sexuality that really challenges heteronormative expectations and assumptions. And what I mean by that, it's people who are marginalized on the basis of their sexuality. So you can undoubtedly include lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender folks in that category. I would also argue that, that women who are resource poor and have children are marginalized by their sexual decisions and might be considered queer. Now, I want to be careful because a lot of people will say, oh, that's a nice academic argument. And I think at some level it is an academic argument. It's about kind of how do we conceptualize this category, queer. But for me, it then becomes, are there political unities between these groups of people that organizers can start to think about how would you build a base for political mobilization? So, you know, so if we begin to broaden who gets included when we begin to think about questions of sexuality, then I think sexuality can have clear class implications. If we talk about, for example, women who are incarcerated and the fact that the state or, you know, prisons and jails have very strict rules, for example, around same-sex relationships in the prisons and their unwillingness to acknowledge those rules and the ways in which women are punished for kind of performing those relationships, then that's not just about, oh, I'm nice and I'm good and there are no costs to that. If we talk about kind of same-sex activity in male prisons and the unwillingness of the criminal justice system to acknowledge that activity and their unwillingness to provide condoms, then the consequences are the possible transmission of HIV. Not because people are just saying I'm good, but because the state is saying to acknowledge those relationships or that sexual activity goes against what we're saying can happen in a prison, right? Mm-hmm. And so it seems to me that that's part of hopefully what Black feminism does or what radical feminism does is to say things that seem like they're just quote unquote sexuality issues have huge, you know, have a huge impact on how people get to live their lives, right? Whether it be as members who are incarcerated or people who are not incarcerated. How we think about questions of sexuality and women engaged in kind of the enterprise of sexual exchange of sex for money. If we don't begin to understand those as both class and sex and usually gender and race issues, then I think we really miss the analysis and trying to intervene in a kind of effective way to kind of transform the life conditions of those women. So, you know, I guess my plea is that we, again, kind of go back to intersectionality, whether it be Kim Crenshaw or Deborah King or Angela Davis or E. Francis White, did I forget anyone? There are lots of people we could talk about, and really struggle with where are these intersections, because it's not only just for kind of analysis and scholarship, but kind of the moment of intersection is really the moment of building a broader movement, at least to me, right? If you can find those places where people may not agree in terms of racial identification or sexual identification, but where they in fact suffer from state regulation or some quote unquote system of oppression, where they share that experience, it seems to me if we can find those spaces, those are also the spaces for shared mobilization. And I think too often our analyses, while kind of gesturing towards those moments, or even sometimes identifying those, don't take the next step and try to kind of see them implemented and kind of in the work that organizers do and just the work that we do outside of the academy.
I think we probably have time for one more question.
I have one question, just with regard to racism and sexism with the Black community, and you had touched on it earlier. Mm-hmm. Black women's issues have always been put on the back burner when we talk about issues of racism and how they affect the Black community. So oftentimes women, you know, one day have to decide, well, I'll be Black today and I'll be female tomorrow, and it's like, well, you know, what about how both affect me? And I'm just wondering if you could speak to your fear or concern in terms of the repercussions of dividing the, you know, these two issues that have been affecting Black people for so many years. And what do you think the effects are just in terms of the whole community as a whole?
I'm going to reveal more and self-identify more. I go to this, I don't only go, I belong to a progressive, affirming Black church, which makes me a Christian also. That's interesting. Yeah, anyway, it's like, and part of our mission is to be affirming in terms of lesbian gay issues, to be progressive in terms of our politics, to engage in social justice, and to root ourselves in kind of Black communities. And one of the things that we all talk about in terms of the mission is providing space where people bring their entire selves, right? All of their complexity, all of their problems, all of their struggles, all their victories, all their insights. And when you think about this question of division, there's clearly a political analysis that we all probably share about what does it mean when people have to choose between, quote unquote, being a woman one day, or making that primary, or making primary their racial identity. And usually, I would argue, it's not a choice, right? It's usually a situation that forces one thing instead of the other. So it's not even, we're not even going to give you the agency to choose. We're just going to make you respond based on certain things. So, it's, we don't want that. And at a political level, it means, I think, providing an analysis where people understand the ways in which these things intersect, the need to build kind of movements that expand beyond one single identity, whether it be race or gender, to understand that usually it's always an intersecting moment, even if it's not visible in that way. But I think, and I should defer to you, but there have to be also at an individual level real damage that happens, right? When, at least I think, and I'm not a psych person, so you could say that's ridiculous, but when people feel like I'm this, even though I know I'm all these other things. The classic example for me is always thinking about sexuality. And it's been a big deal actually to go back into a Black church, because quite often in the past it's been, to be in a Black church meant you could be out as a feminist, you could be, maybe, you could be clearly a race woman, but you couldn't be a Black lesbian. And sometimes in some Black churches you can't be progressive or radical, right? So what does it mean, I think, to create spaces where people can bring themselves? And it seems to me that's what, we're going to end here. That's what probably I think is the, one of the things that feminism should do, and any progressive analysis and movement, which is to provide space where people can be their whole selves and can then use all of those resources that they bring to the table to create, to first envision what a great and wonderful society might look like, and then to work towards that, right? I mean, my worry, for example, when working with young people, is that they can't even begin the process of imagining a society in which they're full members. Like, what does it mean to kind of have that type of creativity, that type of imagination, that type of feeling of status and empowerment completely cut off, not from one young person, but from a generation of a whole community? And so it seems to me that part of the politics is creating that space where people can envision, do that kind of imaginary work, and then bring all the resources that they have, as well as kind of combine resources with other people to really put that vision into action and to transform the society. And hopefully, the work that I do, both as a scholar and an activist, and the intersection of the two, can help in that project.
Well, that is a great place to finish up, and I want to thank you again for coming, because this has been wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Difficult, I bow to no man's word. I wanna be who I believe in freedom and not rest. We here believe in freedom and not rest until it comes. Bum bum ba dum bum 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 bum.